Hi everyone, my name's Sean. I'm a beekeeper. I've been keeping bees in London for probably about 10 years now. But I'm also really interested in insects in general and just wanted to talk to you a little bit about pollination. So first let's just start by getting our heads around what pollination is. So most of us are kind of familiar with it. We know it's a thing, we know it's important for our food, but let's just kind of break it down into a little bit more detail. So most plants will be producing some kind of pollen, and the pollen is a way in which they kind of transfer genes from one generation, from one plant to another plant. So they'll make these pollen grains which contain some genetic material from the parent plant, and then that will get transferred into another flower of another plant, and then that will be the point from which the seed grows and emerges. So originally plants were just doing this by using the wind, so it would make an enormous amounts of pollen and it would get kind of blown around in the wind, and then if the plant was lucky it would bump into another flower, and then that would produce a new generation. And that was quite costly for plants because they just have to produce so much pollen that it wouldn't be able to, it's an enormous expensive energy. And then slowly over time insects began to get involved. So an insect would go and eat some of the pollen and get some pollen on it and transfer it across to the flower. And then plants began to adapt to that and began to specialize in attracting insects in. So what they would do is slowly began to produce nectar and produce more and more visual or kind of attractive things that would draw insects in. So that's what the situation we're in now, where we've got the whole range of amazing flowering plants. All of that is about enticing insects in, or not always insects, but mostly insects, into the flower. They'll generally go in because they want to get some of the nectar, and then they'll get pollen on them in some way, and then they'll transfer that pollen across to another flower. So this process is vital for the production of the next generation of seeds, but also for the more kind of for human needs, it's also essential for the production of fruits and vegetables. So most vegetables are some way connected to the seed in some way. So if you imagine a tomato, the seeds are inside, but it's the tomato itself that we eat. So that hopefully that kind of will make it a little bit clearer. So this process has been going on for millions of years, and the insects have been involved in that process for a really, really long time. So what's happened is we've got more and more kind of specialization now. So some insects can only pollinate some flowers, and some flowers are specialized so that they can only be received by insects with very long tongues, for example. But the process generally is more or less the same. So from the insect's perspective, most of the time they're going for the nectar, but also sometimes they're consuming the pollen. So they'll gather the pollen, and generally they'll use that to feed their young. So pollen is they're very dense molecules. They're very dense structures. They're quite often these quite amazing geometric patterns, and they're quite tough. So because they're designed to be kind of battered around in the environment and get rained on and all that kind of stuff without going moldy. So generally most insects will do is they'll take it and they'll ferment it in some way so the pollens break down, and then inside there's lots of protein, and often they're fed to the younger generation of the insects, generally bees. Whereas nectar is more like the carbs. So nectar is got sugars in it, and that's what the insects generally are using to power their flight. So you've got nectar, which is what's kind of attracting the insects into the flowers in the first place, being the carby food, and then you've got the pollen being the more kind of protein-rich food. So so I said we've got different types of flowers attracting different types of insects, but also different bees or different insects will behave in different ways. So some insects are what's called polylactic, so they'll go and gather pollen and nectar from a whole enormous variety of different plants. different families, different color flowers, different shapes. They're kind of like generalists. And then you've got some bees which are more ogliolectic, which means they kind of gather from a narrower range of plants. So that might be that they'll only forage from one family of plants, for example, or one particular kind of flower shape. And then you've got the other group, which are the monolectics, and they're really only foraging from one single species. So you can imagine the generalists, as the landscape changes, are a little bit more adapted to navigate changes. Whereas if an insect's only foraging on one species at a time, and that species suddenly, that plant isn't around so much, then that can be a disaster for them. So there's a kind of constant dance throughout the year of flowering plants coming into flower, and also on a more micro scale, there's a constant dance of the way the nectar flow is attracting different insects. So it's like this kind of symphony of behavior of flowers interacting with insects, but then also flowers and plants interacting with the landscape. So the amount of sun, the amount of humidity, the temperature, the nutrition that the plant has, all of that is going to be fluctuating the amount of nectar that the plant is releasing, and that's going to impact the amount that the insects are going to be attracted to it. So sometimes you might notice in your gardens that there'll be you'll go past a plant that's flowering, there's not many bees on it, and then you come back another day and it's buzzing with bees. Generally that's because of the way the nectar flow is working. So we often, when we think about pollination, often the conversation centers around honeybees. So honeybees are wonderful pollinators. They're kind of generalists, like we talked about. They can pollinate a wide range of things, but also I think we've kind of overemphasized the functionality of honeybees in the landscape, and particularly in relationship to the food system. So generally, the honeybees are the insects that we can control, so we kind of emphasize that a little bit more. But actually there's an enormous range of different pollinators. So honeybees aren't the only insects at the table. So we're going to talk a little bit more in another couple of videos about the solitary bees and the bumblebees, but also a whole load of other insects are involved in pollination, and generally that because lots of them aren't so much generalists, they tend to be a little bit more at risk. So it's really important that what we want to be looking for is a landscape filled with a diverse range of pollinators, which is kind of supplemented by honeybees rather than being entirely dependent on honeybees at the expense of all the other insects. So for example, we think about how honeybees are so essential for the food system, which they are, but lots of food crops that we are actually can only be pollinated by bumblebees, for example. So the family of plants that has tomatoes in it, those flowers, they only release their pollen when they get the particular vibration of a bumblebee. So bumblebees are essential for those, and cucumbers, a lot of the kind of glasshouse crops are totally dependent on bumblebees. So let's not forget about all the other wonderful wild pollinators out there, and hopefully begin to support them as much as we can in our gardens. We might be asking, well, what is it that's so important about pollinators, and why is there this crisis that's happening with pollinators in our landscapes, and why is it important that we begin to do something about it in our own gardens? So we've really, to kind of place it in context, since the Second World War, we've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows, 60% of our traditional orchards, 300,000 miles of hedgerow, and almost half of our ancient broadleaf woodland has been cleared for conifer plantation or agriculture. So we've radically changed the way we're losing the landscape. Also in that time, there's been a massive increase in pesticide, herbicide and fungicide use, and the ways in which we're farming, much more monocultures, much more heavy ploughing. So all of that has had a massive impact on all these amazing wild pollinators, and many of them have been in a steady decline, and many of them are actually in danger of becoming extinct. And then on top of that, we've got climate change with this increasingly erratic weather patterns, which makes these insects that are a bit more marginable even more under stress. So we're at a stage now where it's vitally important that we all begin to start looking after and supporting the wild pollinators as much as we can, in as many ways as we can. Okay, thank you.